Our study in the book of Numbers continues today with chapters 14 and 15. And I've titled the study, The Fearful and the Faithless. Well, we're going to pick up our study with a little review. Now, the children of Israel in Numbers 13 felt discouraged and afraid after hearing the evil report from the 10 spies. They acknowledged that the land was everything the Lord had promised, but that it was also a land that eateth up the inhabitants. Numbers 13 and verse 33. And there we saw, they said, the giants, and we were in our sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Well, in Numbers chapter 14, let's begin with a question. What occurs when believers hesitate to step out in faith and trust God? Now, the tragic answer to that question is indeed found in Numbers 14. Well, after rejecting Caleb's desperate plea for faith and courage, the congregation of Israel in verse 1 of chapter 14 returned to their tents, and we read, and they lifted up their voices and they cried, and the people wept that night. You get a real sense of just the total discouragement that arose because of the report of the 10 spies. Now, fear, understand, soon transformed into rebellion as the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron. The entire congregation said unto them in verse 2 of chapter 14, "Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness." There's a lot of things that come to mind that are strikingly humorous for me. If their concern was death, why would they rather die in Egypt? Why would they rather die in the wilderness? Why not just go ahead, cross over, trust God, and maybe you'll die in the process of trying to conquer the land, but God has promised He will give you that which He has promised. Well, the murmuring against the Lord and His leader, Moses, soon escalated into an accusation claiming that God intended to harm them. In other words, they supposed that God meant evil. And so we read in verse 3 that He had brought Israel out of Egypt only to allow them to, quote, fall by the sword, and that their wives and children should be a prey. Consider then fear and murmuring transformed into a plan of insurrection. And so in verse 4, finally the people decided to choose a leader, that is another leader, and return into Egypt. In response, in verse 5, Moses and Aaron fell on their faces in an act of humiliation. And we read in verse 6 that Joshua and Caleb, the spies who had faith to trust God, that they rent their clothes. And they pleaded them with the people, saying in verse 8, the land which we passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. In verse 8, if the Lord delight in us, then He will bring us into this land and give it us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. And only, verse 9, rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land. Watch this now, for the Lord is with us. Fear them not. Well, the response of the people is certainly one of human nature. For the people rose to stone Joshua and Caleb in verse 10 because the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle. That is, God's presence suddenly interrupted their desire to kill Joshua and Caleb. The Lord threatened to afflict the people in His wrath. And in verse 11 and 12, and to disinherit them. Moses, however, pleaded with the Lord not to give Israel's enemies cause to say He had slain them, because He could not bring them into the promised land. In other words, Lord, don't kill these your people, lest the enemies of Israel say, well, look at what God's Israel has done, for it has killed them. And so Moses appealed to the Lord, recalling the attributes of God, and he said in verse 18, the Lord is long-suffering and of great mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgression, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity, the sins, the wickedness of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. Now, obviously, what he's quoting there is all the way back to Exodus 20, one of the 10 commandments, and the warning of that commandment. So based on God's divine character, Moses prayed in verse 19, "Pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people according unto the greatness of thy mercy, and as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt even unto now." Well, we find the Lord heard and heeded Moses' prayer. In verses 20 through 23, nevertheless, God is just, and he would not allow Israel's rebellion and faithlessness to go unpunished. And so we read in verses 22 and 23 that the faithless spies who brought the evil report were slain. God then determined that the whole congregation would be turned away from Canaan, the promised land, and the people would be wasted in the wilderness. That literally, they would die in the wilderness. And then all of Israel, those who were 20 years and older, except for Caleb and Joshua, the two faithful spies, all would die in the wilderness. Why? Because they murmured against the Lord. Well, in verse 39, when Moses announced God's judgment, we read, "The people mourned greatly. With remorse, they rose early the next day, and they determined to go up and cross over into the promised land, but this time without the Lord," in verse 40. And so Moses, however, warned that they would not prosper with these haunting words, "For the Lord is not among you." Israel's presumption was doomed without the Lord's presence, power, and protection. Consequently, many of Israel were slain. Now briefly, Numbers 15. Here we have God's judgments for sins committed out of ignorance and deliberate sins. Numbers 15 marked the beginning of Israel's tragic 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Now, this wandering time begins in chapter 15, and it will go all the way through chapter 21. Now, the sacrifices instituted were not only, we read, Israel's obligation, but also that of the strangers who journeyed with Israel, that is, non-Jewish people, people who were not of Abraham's lineage. Now, why was that? Why must the strangers sacrifice even as the Jewish people did? And the answer is there was one law and one manner that God would allow, verses 15 and 16. Now, there were sacrifices, we read in verse 24 through 29, for sins committed out of ignorance, meaning unknowingly. There was also the issue of willful and presumptuous sins. Now, the punishment for those sins was, and I quote, that soul, that one that willfully rebels against God, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. Well, soon after that law was pronounced, there was a man in Israel who willfully broke the law by gathering sticks on the Sabbath as an act of public rebellion. Well, given the seriousness of his actions, the man was, we read, taken in ward, that is, in custody. And Moses and Aaron then sought the mind of the Lord. And the Lord then directed that all the congregation would put the sinner out of the camp and stone him. Literally, carry out God's judgment. Well, here's a closing thought. As a lasting reminder, the Lord decreed that the children of Israel were to wear a blue ribbon with tassels on the fringes of their garments. The garments served as a visual reminder, and I quote, to remember, verse 39, remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, and that you seek not after your own heart. Verse 40, that ye may remember and do all my commandments and be holy unto your God. And then the Lord said, I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Well, what an exciting study we find ourselves now in the midst of. We'll continue our study tomorrow as we begin to understand the tragedy of Israel's failure to trust God. Turning back into the wilderness, they will die there. In fact, over the next 40 years, at this point it would be more like 38 years, they would see again and again the responsibility of burying their loved ones because they lacked faith to trust God. May you and I not be so foolish. May we put our faith and trust in the Lord and obey Him. God bless, and bye-bye.